All right, chapter. How I got there? Great. Chapter 5 in your book, which I'll get to in just a second. Chapter 5 in your book, which it looks like starts on page 167. As you can see, it's entitled How to Use CSS Box Model for Spacing, Borders, and Backgrounds. And I'm going to come at this in a little different way. If you look up on the screen here, all right, this picture may or may not make any sense, but what I want you to understand is every single thing you put in the body of a web page goes into a box. Even if you don't see the box, it's there. So for instance, let's say that I did an H1 and I put in there hello. That's all I've got. Then that H1, that hello, that's the content. All right? Probably makes sense. All right? Around the content, you've got padding. What most people have a hard time understanding when they're starting with this stuff is the difference between margin and padding. So I'm going to show you in just a minute. All right? But this is what I'm trying to show you, that everything goes into a box. That's the content. That box has padding around it. If you've run something like a normalize, that padding may have been set to 0. That border may be set to none. That margin may be set to 0. But if you have not run a normalize or a reset, certain things that you put in will automatically have padding and or margin and possibly a border. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. So all I did was I went out to W3 Schools. This is their box model, and they explain. I'm going to just show you that. The content, again, is what's in the box. The padding is what's immediately around the content. The border is actually between the padding and the margin. All right? And the margin is outside of the border. So many times people find this confusing. So what I did, and believe me, this is nothing at all fantastic. Is I wrote this little program. And the bad thing is you can see how bad my screen here looks. I got to find it. Yeah, that is it, but that's it in HTML. I think it's here. It's not there. Yes, I am. All right. So, and I'll show you the text for this in just a minute. This is something that I created right there. And as it says, this div has no top margin or padding, no right margin or padding, no bottom margin or padding, and no left margin or padding. In other words, it's just there. It doesn't have anything special. Okay? Now, this one has got 250 pixels of padding on the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. All that white area, all right? It's not padding, it's margin, my apologies. That's all margin. But notice the margin is outside of the content. Does that make sense? That's the key thing. Why? Because look at the next one. That's got 250 pixels also. That's padding. So do you understand how when you use padding, it's physically, basically, it's part of the content, but when you use margin, it's not. Does that make sense? Sometimes I'll say that to people and like, yeah, it makes sense. And other times it's like, I don't have a freaking clue as to what you're talking about. Yes. Question? No, I'm thinking so. Okay. But, and I'd be more than happy, I can send this to everybody. Like I said, it's nothing fantastic. Here's the source. Again, what did I do? I've got a thing called nothing div, so it's got zero margin, zero padding. Got margin, where it's got 250 pixels all the way around it. And I've got one called got padding, which has got 250 pixels of padding all the way around it. So all that is, when you look at it, is this. Now I realize that doesn't show that well on here, but so nothing, just put a border, background and a color, but there's no padding, there's no margin. And actually, if I wanted to be sure, I could have come in here and said, I can't do it in here, but I could have come underneath that and said margin 0, padding 0. Probably should have said that, just to be sure. Here, notice I've set margin, but I haven't set padding. And here I've set padding, but I haven't set margin. So to be true, so to speak, to this, I probably should have come in here and I should have said padding 0, which would have turned off any padding that the browser may have put in. I should have come in here and said margin 0 for the same reason. And then I could have come in here and said padding 0, margin 0. When you use 0 in one of these, you don't have to say pixels or points or ems or anything else. You don't have to. All right? You might raise your hand and go, oh, why'd you use pixels and not ems? Because I did. All right? I just wanted to throw together a really simple example. All right? But I'm more concerned with, do you have at least an elementary understanding of the difference between margin, which is technically outside of the content, and padding, which is technically part of the content itself? I'll take his question then yours. Go ahead.
Okay, so padding, that's the background color?
It's not the background color. It's not even really the background. Again, you got to kind of look at it like this. Content, this is the way they showed it in the book. Around the content, you've got padding. Around the padding, you've got border. And around the border, you've got margin.
Will the background go all the way out to the outer edge of the padding?
If you do a background, it depends on what you put it on and whether or not you've got a border. That's why with a lot of people, when they put backgrounds in on individual elements, they'll put a border on. Then it will go around the whole thing. All right, that's my picture. It's not nearly as colorful as what the author did. Question?
Between the pixels and M's percentages, is there one that's like preferred?
Yeah, question was between these, okay, which one is preferred? Again, remember, pixels and points, px and pt, are absolute units of measure. They are not preferred ever. M's, EMs, or percentages are always the preferred. That's why I had you put them on the test. All right? So you can go there and you can look at it. I wanted to show you this too, just so you see this. All right? You don't have to go out there, but you can if you want to. This is a terrific site for anything HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. This is the developer.mozilla.org site. All right? And if you go out there, notice web technology for developers. And it even breaks it up. HTML and CSS, and there's JavaScript down here. And they've got other stuff that's in here as well. Okay? Some people don't like this site because in many ways, it's written like something that's written by a technical writer. So in other words, it's the kind of thing you could read and probably fall asleep with. It's not exciting text, all right? But it's just there and it's got a ton of information in it. All right, so there, they've got a whole big thing on the box model. All right, you can see how they do it. Again, I'd rather give you too much information than not enough stuff. All right. So jumping back into the book then, it says in the last chapter we talked some about formatting. Now we'll learn the properties for controlling spacing between elements. That's what we're going to be concerned with right now. Later on, it still may look funky if you change the size of your browser window. because that's not until Chapter 8 when we go over responsive web design. All right? So it says specifically you'll learn how to use the box model. The author's got his own picture in there. It's not that different from the other ones that you've seen. How to size and space elements. A web page that illustrates this. Then borders and backgrounds. And a web page that has borders and backgrounds. All right? I'm not going to go back over and talk about this box model again. We've already talked about it. All right? The big thing, Chris, you'd asked this question before, but if you look up on this page right here, typically if you're going to use nothing but pixels and points, you're going to build a web page that's fixed in size. And that used to be the realm because virtually everyone who looked at a web page was looking at the web page on either a desktop or a laptop. In fact, if you go back long enough, it was a desktop for everybody. Then it was a desktop or a laptop. And now it's changed that more phones and tablets are in vogue. What we want is eventually, when we bring the Leave Me at Home site up after Chapter 8, I want it to look really professional on this phone. Why? Because, you know, Tom is older than I am. He's in his, I think, about 64 or 65. But where he lives, listening to him, it's pretty yuppieville in there. And my guess is most of the people, men or women, who are going to book his services eventually are going to do it through their phone. And you want to make it look nice in the phone, just like you want it to look nice every place else. We'll get to that point. That won't be on this test. So this is the way the author shows it. You might like it better. You might like it worse. All right? But I tried showing you a picture that, to me, the one with the boxes around each other, I thought that was easier to take a look at and comprehend than what the author put in here. You may or may not agree with that. And again, I also told you, and I don't want to belabor it, belittle it too much, but again, top, right, bottom, left. And there's shortcuts. Virtually everything that the author will talk about in here for margin, virtually everything appears exactly the same as padding, except you swap out the word margin for the word padding. And it's where actually it appears. The best way for you to learn how to use this stuff is to just dummy up a web page. You can even use your test page or make a copy or whatever. All right, use that contact form and play with margin and play with padding. That's the best way for you to learn it, I think. All right. And they talk about formulas for calculating the height of boxes. All right. Is that important? It is a little bit now because we haven't talked responsive yet. Once you start talking more responsive, that's not as important. All right. So it's not my goal in here to read to you, but they do talk to you about the box model, why it's important. All right. If you want more on this, you know, I think I mentioned this site to you before. It's CSS Tricks. And if you go out to CSS Tricks, they've got a pretty good article too on the box model. Again, it just depends. I mean, if you say, well, I get it, then don't go out there. I don't care. But if you struggle through this and you're like, I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about, that's another place that you can go. In fact, for your homework for Chapter 5 or 6, for one of them, you have to go out and look at some of this stuff. And it is CSS Tricks. So it's css-tricks.com. And it's funny, not like this is a big thing. You may or may not have heard this before. Anytime you create your own domain name, you are highly discouraged from ever using a hyphen in a name. People just don't put it in. They're not intuitive enough to realize it's CSS-Tricks. All right? Not that you can't do it, all right, but it's not a recommended practice. All right. As it says, there are properties that you can use to control margin, to control padding, and to control borders. Notice these are all for block elements. You now know what block elements are. Remember, block elements, line before, line after type of things, divs, etc., paragraphs. All right. not inline elements like a bold or a strong tag, an M or an I tag. So they give you a web page here that demonstrates this stuff. Now, you may not like this, but the author, I think, did it like this on purpose to kind of show you what's with what. And if you look in here, not very much in here. There's an H1, there's a paragraph. That's inside of main. Then what does he do? He puts a border and a margin dotted black around everything. That should be this thing that's out here, right? That's around the whole thing. Then he says around main, so whatever's in main, and what's in main? Oh, pretty much everything. So around main, put a 2-pixel solid black border. That's this one. All right. Then he says, okay, with an H1 and P tags, put a dashed black border around them and add padding. The padding is, again, what's in here, and there's the dashed. All right. That's why I said I'm going to have to really think about this one. There is a chance, I don't know yet. I'll have to go back and reread this. There's a chance I may not give you a test this week. I may combine the stuff with 5 and 6 with 7 and 8. What I don't want is to ever give you a test where it's quarter 2 and you're all running up to me saying, we only have half this done, where everybody fails. That's definitely the last thing in the world I want to do. All right? But I also really don't want to give a test where you can get everything done in a half an hour to an hour. All right? So we'll see. All right, so how to size and space elements, how to set heights, and how to set widths. Some of this you've looked at already. Some of this you haven't looked at already. All right? We've done things with width, and we've done things with height. We've done those mainly on our images. And we've put in exact sizes. All right? One thing that you're going to notice when we move into responsive stuff is we're just going to set one of those properties and we'll set it to 100%. And why 100%? Because then the image will automatically resize itself based on the type of media we have. All right? Notice not only are there width and height, but there's max and min width, max and min height. Okay? So notice it says a relative or absolute value. Again, going back to Mr. Hardy's question. A relative value would be an M or a percentage. An absolute value would be a pixel or a point. I just want you to get used to using relative values for everything you do, or virtually everything you do. Once you do that, then you don't have to worry. And especially when it comes in to making stuff responsive, it's much easier to do. So again, there's examples. Now notice there's even a width and there's a height auto. And it says there, the width is based on the containing block. That's the default. The height is based on the containing block. That's the default. What does default mean? Unless told otherwise. All right? You can turn off everything again in a normalized.css or a reset.css, but if you don't, the width is set to auto, the height is set to auto. That's the content area. What's the content area? If you've got a div ID equal wrapper and everything's in there, that's that. If you've got a main, that's that. All right. Question? Oh, okay. And again, they talk about percentages. Notice, this stuff can be used to accommodate a change in font size. I want to show you very quickly why that's important. You're going to do the chapter 5 and 6 homework on your own. I think it's the 5, but we'll find out. Here's the chapter 5 homework. You've got to create something that looks like this. Everybody see how well, when I make it small enough, there. It doesn't look too bad. But when I start monkeying with the height and the width, because I didn't set anything, that looks pretty bad. That would look pretty unprofessional on a website. All right? You know, I read something once, and maybe I've even said it to you, where somebody said, you know, every time you open up a web page, you're testing it. And that's the truth. All right? Whether you're a user or whether you're the person who created it. So again, when you work with margin, the key thing is what I told you. Like I always say, look at it like a clock. All right? 12 at the top is top. 3, all right, which is on the right side is right. 6 on the bottom is bottom. 9 on the left is left. You can set any one of these. You can set none of these. You can set all of these in any combination or in a multiple number of ways. If I know, for example, that I want a 20 pixel margin around everything, I'm just going to say margin colon 20 pixels. Or if it's an M, margin colon 1M. That's much easier than saying margin top 1M, margin bottom, etc. If you decide you're going to use all of these, you can put them in any order. Did you hear that? All right, so if you're putting them in your CSS, some people like the top right, bottom left. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. There are also shortcuts. I already mentioned one of them to you. For instance, if I say, actually I mentioned 2 of them. If I say margin 20, let's just say 1M. That means I want top, right, bottom, left. If I say margin 1M, 2M, that means this goes for top and bottom, this goes for right and left. There's even another one that if you put in 3 of the numbers, I don't know if it tells it in here or not. After a while, I find that confusing. All right? But there are a bunch of shortcuts that are built in for this. So I don't think there's anything in here that I haven't already told you regarding margins. All right? So here, this is the one with 3. Okay, so 1 sets everything. 2 will set the same value for the top and bottom and the same value for the left and right. 3 says 0.5. All right. So this will be the top, this will be the right and left, and that will be the bottom. All right. I would say that, you know, especially, you know, right here, there are people that I know who do this professionally that say if they're going to set all 4 of them, okay, and especially if they're going to set all 4 of them, they're going to be different numbers, they'll use 4 tags. It's a little more bloated because it's 4 lines of code as opposed to 1. But it's whatever you're more comfortable with. That's what you should be using. We already talked about this. You typically use the keyword auto to center an element in its containing block. We talked about that with the div a while back, where we said margin 0 auto. You now know what that means. That means 0 pixels, top, bottom, automatically center it right, left. Padding, again, as I mentioned, padding is virtually the same as margin. The only difference is where it's being applied, all right, into your element, onto your element, whatever. They're giving you basically the same examples here. Right? So again, if you look here, why do you use this stuff? Why do you use margin? Why do you use padding? Because if you've got a site, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but especially looking at a page such as this one right here. Well, I guess I can't make it too much smaller. But there's not a lot of color in it. There's a little color at the top and a little bit here, but the point is there's enough text in here. A lot of times on web pages, there's a lot of text on certain pages. You don't want everything to have 0 margin, 0 padding because it's too hard for people to read. I mean, if you don't believe that, look at your book. All right? You've got margin and padding in your book because it's easier for you to read. And a web page is pretty much the same way. So they give you in here both the CSS, and they give you the actual HTML. All right, then they talk about this reset selector. Now, that's their own reset, basically, the CSS version for this page. This reset selector, remember, you may or may not remember this thing that's now really, it's up at the top there. The asterisk means it's the universal selector. That means that by default, everything has no margin and no padding. Does that make sense? All right. Virtually all professional web pages that you see done today have normalize or reset.css or something in them. And if they don't, you can oftentimes tell, because if you go and you run it on different browsers, it might look quite a bit different, because the default margins, padding, etc. between different browsers is different. And remember, when you start to put in your own stuff, you're taking control. You're saying, I want at the top of each page there to be this margin, this padding, etc. All right, the rest of the chapter here is on borders and backgrounds. Take a look at the borders. Does what I'm saying right now, does this make sense to you? If I wanted to set a border that had a side on it, that had a width on it, that had a style on it, that had a color, that had a side width, a side, etc., I could use virtually all of these together. In other words, I could either put border and stick everything in there, or I could have each one listed separately. Just like I could say margin, colon, and then put in 4 things, or I can say margin top, margin bottom, margin right, margin left. And that's what they're saying here. So notice right here, this is a pretty simple example. This is going to set a border up. It's going to be thin. What does that mean? Well, that means it can be browser specific. It's thin. You're not giving it a size. It's solid, and it's green in color. Again, when you use the word green, it may look different on different browsers, because the default green, for example, on Firefox might look different than the default green that's on Chrome. All right? So there's a lot of ways. Not only that, when you look here, you can set these up a lot differently. So why am I going through the trouble of telling you this? If I put in CSS Borders, as always, it's going to jump me to W3 Schools at the beginning, and then it's going to give you examples of all of these, dotted, dashed, etc. So notice that example, and then you can see all of them. All right? Some people find some of these things to be a little hard on the eyes. All right? For instance, if you had a black background and a white dash border, it may or may not look good. All right? A lot of times you'll find people will use solid more than anything else. And also notice that by default, when you put the border around it, see how it's pushed up against it? Borders, remember, borders, you can sit there and you can take all that stuff and you can add padding and you can add margin. All right. Rounded corners and shadows, you can bet that and it will be right this time, that for the next test, you will do some work with shadows. You already did. Well, you'll do more work with shadows then. You'll also do work with some or all of the pictures. Now, this property right here, border radius, this is a CSS3 property. Now, you may or may not remember this, but I showed you this before. Then I went out to caniuse.com. Now if I type in border radius, basically all browsers support it now. When I did this a couple years ago, about a third of this was red because it wasn't supported. All right. Why do you do it? You do it for effect. Notice when you set this stuff up, By default, if you set a border radius, notice here, the third one is gone. All right? And there's no radius there. All right? You can make everything rounded. You can make part of it rounded. You can do whatever it is you want to or need to do with both the radius and with the shadow effect. All right? The problem is, if I give you your next test and I say, now put a border radius on that's this, put a box shadow on that's this, I am, in my opinion, I'm stifling your creativity. I don't want to do that. But I might say something like, add a border radius to this, add a box shadow to this. And then you can figure out the color that you want to use on it. All right? And here's the text for it. As it says, positive values offset the shadow right or down. Negative offset the shadow to the left or up. We'll talk more about negative stuff as we go on. Have you ever had a web page that it comes up, or maybe as it's coming up, you see something that literally slides in from off the page from left to right? All right. If you've ever seen that, that means that originally where it was located on the page was negative. It's off the page. Okay? And you can make it negative this way, or you can make it negative this way, if you want it to slide in from left to right or from right to left. And notice it says these properties are supported by all modern browsers. If they aren't supported by a browser, they're typically ignored. What does that mean? It means if somebody's still using IE6 or IE7 or IE8 or IE9, typically, if that comes up, it just literally ignores it and it treats it like it's not there. So how to set background colors and images. We've looked at background already. You know this. I mentioned this. You may or may not remember it, but I mentioned this at the beginning of the semester. You can say either background or you can say background hyphen color. I don't see the reason to put background hyphen color because it's just making you type in an extra 6 characters. But if you think, no, I want that, it makes me feel better, then do that. All right? Not only that, you can put an image in for the background. Why would you want to do that? Well, a lot of times what you'll notice is somebody will have something really small for a background image, really small. And by default, unless they tell it otherwise, it repeats as many times on the page as it can. But, so when you have an image, you can do no repeat, which means put it in there once. You can do repeat, which means put it in there as many times as you can. You can do repeat X, which means repeat it there as many times as you can. Or you can do a repeat Y, which means do it there as many times as you can. All right? Maybe I did it backwards. But you get the idea. Now, when you work on this, notice, because this is the key one. This is putting a background image in. Notice the syntax for it. Background colon, okay, forget the blue for a minute. It says URL, and then it's grabbing that image. And that will become your background. The blue is important because what that will do, just so you know, let's say this is my background. And let's say my image that I want to put in is this big. Then by default, what will happen is the rest of this will be whatever your current color is. Quite often it'll be white. But by saying blue, that'll take that and make it blue. All right? Now again, do you have to do that? Should you do that? It always depends on what it is you're doing. One of the most important things as a web developer is that you're constantly being kept in touch with your client. There should never be any surprises. Hey, this is what I did. What do you think? Also, why should you invest a lot of time and effort into it to have them say, not at all what I'm looking for, thanks. All right. So again, the repeat X, which does it horizontally. I may have said it backwards. The repeat Y, which does it vertically. The no repeat, which only does it, puts it in there once. and the repeat, which does an X and a Y. All right. Then if you really want to learn this, because this is how I don't have the program anymore, but I went out and got a little basically a little favicon that had the little smiley face on it. Remember the little yellow face, dot, dot, and a smile? And do that and do a repeat, and it'll put it 1,000 times on the page. All right, but that's full repeat. Okay, then do a no repeat, and you'll see it just in the upper left-hand corner. Do a repeat X, and you'll see it as many times as it can go horizontally. Do a repeat Y as many times as you can vertically. All right. And the other thing, too, is sometimes what you hear is rather than an image, you'll hear the term watermark. And that truly is not an image. And you say, watermark? Well, what a lot of companies will do is they've got their own watermark. So if they put out official documentation, you can tell it's theirs because it has their watermark in the background. All right? And it may have even special stuff on there that other people, it's very hard, if not impossible, for other people to copy. Don't use a background color or image that makes the text that it's over hard to read. Now, again, hopefully that just makes sense. All right. The other thing that's in here is they talk about gradients. All right. I look at gradients maybe differently than other people do. I don't know. But if I put in gradient here, back CSS, that's what I want. Okay? You may or may not be able to tell, but the blue here is darker than the blue here. I look at gradients in a way as being like a morphing. All right? You know what I all know what I mean when I say morph? You know, when something literally is changing. When my kids are all in their 20s now, but when my kids were little, they all watched Barney, all right, which you may or may not have ever even heard of. But one of the best things I ever saw on the internet was they had a thing of Barney morphing into Adolf Hitler. All right? And literally over time, you'd see the picture just change. So Barney would become Hitler. That's a morphing. But with gradients, you're morphing colors. And you can morph linear. And you can morph radial. All right? There's a good example right there. Notice it's a linear gradient. You can see it's going from red to yellow. All right? Sometimes people don't like doing it that way. They like it go from left to right, or they like it where it goes maybe from the center one way or the other way. You will be putting a gradient in on your next test. Again, I will tell you to do that. I will not say use these colors. No, I don't want to do that. If you have picked colors that are on your website right now for the leavemeathome.com, where it wouldn't work well with a gradient, then change your color. Right? But again, this is a good example because they go through all of them in here. Just W3 Schools and search for gradients. So they give you the syntax, so the direction, the percentages that you're going to use, etc. These are pretty good examples here. So as it says, linear gradients let you create gradients for backgrounds without using images. So again, you are doing it for effect. All right. Now it says today virtually all of the modern browsers support this, except for Internet Explorer and Edge. Then, as they've been doing, they go through another web page here. You can see they've got some rounded stuff in here. They've got a gradient in here for the color. All right, they've got the associated CSS. And that's it for this chapter. So let's take just a second, and I guess what I'll have to do is print this out during the break. But I want to give you your, did I give you the homework for chapters 5 and 6 yet? I don't think I did. So I will print those out during the break, a copy of that for everybody. All right. and then we can go over that. All right, so let me stop this.